Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we will cover the difference between progressive overload and overloading training for hypertrophy training. Let's first establish what overloading training is. Overloading training simply refers to training that is stimulative enough to induce an adaptation. This means that training must be difficult enough to actually cause our body to change. So basically there is a minimum threshold of training difficulty which needs to be met for muscle growth to occur. Training below this threshold simply isn't difficult enough to stimulate changes to our physiology. There is also a maximum threshold of training. So if trainees perform training that surpasses what they can recover from, they also won't see hypertrophy adaptations. So overloading training is when we train in this sweet spot where it is enough training to see adaptation, but not so much that we can't recover from it. These thresholds also change over time as a trainee becomes more advanced. As a trainee becomes bigger and stronger, they need to perform more difficult training to reach this minimum threshold. This brings us to the topic of progressive overload. Progressive overload is a fairly simple concept. It refers to making training more difficult over time. This can be from week to week, mesocycle to mesocycle, or year to year. For any adaptation to occur from any form of training, progressive overload must be applied in some way. So how do these concepts relate to hypertrophy training? To understand this, we need to cover some fundamental training variables related to hypertrophy training. The first is proximity to failure. This refers to how close each set is taken to failure. As a quick summary, we generally want to take sets around 1 to 3 reps before failure for lower rep compound lifts, and 0 to 2 reps before failure for high rep isolation lifts. This is the most fundamental variable for hypertrophy training, as this is what makes each set of an exercise effective. Next, we have rep ranges and load. The rep range we perform an exercise in will determine the load used. So these factors are essentially two different sides of the same coin. To maximize hypertrophy adaptations, we generally want to lift somewhere in the 6 to 20 rep range. Some exercises are better suited to the lower end of this range, while other exercises are better suited to the higher end. Now we can discuss volume for hypertrophy training. Volume in the context of hypertrophy training refers to the number of sets performed per muscle group per week. Assuming that we take each set close enough to failure and we are training in an appropriate rep range, volume appears to be the primary driving factor of muscle growth. More volume generally results in greater muscle growth up until a point, then more volume than this may result in less growth. So how do these variables relate to the concepts of overloading training and progressive overload? Well, essentially, if we are training with the appropriate proximity to failure, rep ranges and volume, then training will be overloading. So if we look back at our graph, good stimulative hypertrophy training will fall somewhere between these two thresholds and provide a hypertrophy stimulus. If we are consistently training with an appropriate stimulus, then we will see gradual muscle growth over time. As the muscle gets bigger and stronger, the threshold for adaptation increases, so we need to apply progressive overload to continue growing. Once progressive overload is applied, we can then perform overloading training once again, and the process repeats itself. So both of these factors are interrelated and cause each other to occur. Let's now have a look at how we can use these concepts to program hypertrophy training. Let's take an example mesocycle of training that simply uses 1 deload week and 3 overloading weeks to show how these concepts can be applied. So week 1 will be lower in volume, where the goal is simply to maintain muscle mass while reducing accumulated fatigue from the previous mesocycle. This is a simple 4-day per week program using an upper-lower split, so each muscle group is trained twice per week. Let's now look at one particular muscle group to understand how overloading training and progressive overload can be applied. For this example, let's take the back muscle group. As we can see here, we are performing 2 exercises for the back with 4 sets each on days 1 and 3. So the total volume for the back is 16 weekly sets, and each set is taken around 1 to 3 reps before failure. Let's also assume the trainee has selected the following loads which allow them to train somewhere in the 6 to 20 rep range. Over the mesocycle, let's say the trainee performs the following reps for each set each week. As we can see here, all variables remain the same and reps increase slowly over time. So progressive overload has occurred naturally as a result of effective training, rather than being strictly prescribed. So clearly, this combination of training variables falls somewhere in the sweet spot between the minimum and maximum training thresholds and has resulted in performance improvements. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.